refer to him as Mike. Mike, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
You bet, Vic. Thanks for having me.
Mike, if you don't mind, could you please give us a brief bio on yourself that won't compromise you remaining anonymous?
Sure. I'm a social worker in my late 30s. Lived in southern Wisconsin my entire life. Got some experience with the rural areas around here as a hiker and a fisherman and different things like that.
You mentioned hiking and fishing. How much time have you spent out in the woods?
I've spent a good amount of time out hiking and fishing, mostly hiking. I would say that in a typical week in the summertime when the weather's nice, I'm out 2 to 3 days a week, maybe for anywhere from 1 to 3 hours per time.
And you've got a lot of experience camping, you said.
Yep, I've been camping ever since I was a little boy, and we've camped in various areas throughout Wisconsin. We've gone as far north as Cable Junction in the past, and we've camped as far south as Baraboo and Madison.
Heading right into your encounters, the first one you had, I understand, happened in winter of 2012. Please tell us about what happened.
Well, the first encounter that I ever had, now at this time I had no prior knowledge of Dogman, had of course heard of maybe different things similar to that, but had never researched it at all. No, on this particular night I was out doing some volunteer social work, and I was part of what's called a homeless intervention task force. And our purpose that night was to go out into areas that had been documented as being a hot spot for homeless activity, where people who are homeless tend to congregate at nighttime and things like that might not be very visible to the public eye. So it takes you out into rural areas, it takes you into areas that are maybe mostly abandoned and things like that during the overnight hours. And this particular leg of this search, I was assigned to a group that was sent out along a path that runs along the river here, just outside of town. So we were in a wooded area. And this was at about 1 o'clock in the morning or so, and very, very cold. And I was in a group of 4 people, and we were walking and searching the area, and I knew this particular area very well. This was my 5th year doing the homeless count, and I had been assigned to this area 3 of those 5 years, so I know it very well. And we were walking back to the area to where the homeless activity was known to be happening. And as we're walking, just to kind of give you an idea, the river was on my right, the woods were to my left, and I'm walking along a path that's a paved path along the river here. And when I say the river is to my right, the river was just to my right. I would say 5 to 7 feet, possibly maybe as far as 10 feet. And then there's a group of trees that lines that side. And the trees are big, tall, old trees. They've been there forever. And as we're walking back to the area, we start to hear a sound coming from the trees. And after just a couple seconds, we're commenting on it to each other, and we're noticing that it seemed to kind of start behind us, but now it seemed to be right beside us, and we're shining our flashlights up into the trees. We're not seeing anything. But every time we go to walk again, the sound started again, and when we would stop again, it would stop. And this went on for 2 to 3 minutes, not for very long, although it seemed long at the time. It was terrifying. What ended up happening at the end of it was there was a loud sound from the trees, and I'm going to call it an explosion, meaning that whatever it was that was making the sound suddenly jumped through the trees faster and harder than it had been moving through the trees before. And all of a sudden, in front of us, one of the trees, which was a big, tall, thick tree, started to shake. And then there was sounds coming from an animal, and it was like a grunting sort of a sound, but not a sound I've ever heard an animal make before. And we stopped, and we just kind of looked at it for a second, and then we formed into a tight group, and we started to walk out of there. And I was at the back of the group, so I'm kind of like the eyes in the back of the head, so to speak. I'm watching behind us as we're walking out of there. I'm walking backwards, and I'm shining my light. And all I can see is this tree shaking, but I can't see an animal anywhere. And we just got out of there, and that was the first encounter.
How many people were in that group that you just mentioned?
4.
4 of you, okay. And when you mentioned whatever it was moving through the trees, are we talking about something up in the canopies, or was it definitely on the ground?
Up in the canopies.
Up in the canopies, okay.
Yes, sir.
When you mentioned that one tree in front of you, that big tree, shaking, how big was this tree?
Well, I would say that this tree was 20 feet off of the ground. I would say that it was probably 18 inches in diameter, maybe bigger. What I can tell you, and I'm estimating, I never measured the size, but what I can tell you is that I did go back to this spot later, and I did, and it kind of sounds funny probably, but I wanted to see, I did try to do that myself. I tried to replicate the motion of the, one of the trees down there, and I wasn't able to get it to move at all. And I mean, I've lifted weights since I was a teenager. I'm in my late 30s. I'm a fairly strong guy, and I wasn't able to get this tree to move in any direction at all, let alone get it to whip back and forth like that.
I don't think that's all that surprising. If you were on the ground trying to move that tree and whatever it was up in the canopy of that tree, it would have a clear advantage of being able to move that tree in the first place. Especially if it was a dog man and had any kind of weight to it, it would really have an advantage that way. But
Sure.
Having said that, is there any chance that it might have been an indigenous animal to that area that was up in that tree moving it?
I highly doubt it, and I say that as somebody who's lived in this area my entire life, and in that particular area, I've spent a lot of time. It's an area that I've gone fishing with family members and friends. I take my kids back there hiking. I have been back there on my own on numerous occasions just to, walk along the river. I enjoy being outdoors. I've never seen an animal do that to a tree in this area ever, not before that or since it. And I've never heard an animal make that kind of a noise, and I've been outdoors around here enough to say that I don't think it's something that's from this area. It's certainly not something I've ever encountered.
In order to move a tree like that, that's not a monster by any means, but it is big enough where in order for an animal to move that tree, even if it's up in the canopy, for it to move it enough where the trunk swayed, it would have to have some pretty impressive weight to it, so that kind of rules that out.
Yeah.
You did say that the grunt that you heard didn't sound like it could have been made by any of the indigenous animals.
No.
Okay, I've got you. Do you know of any reports of people being attacked or killed or turning up missing in that area?
Yes, I do. In fact, there's a situation that's happening right now where it goes back to this past May. There was an elderly woman who disappeared, and the last place she had been seen was right in this same area. And her body turned up in the river a week after she disappeared, and there was signs of head trauma, but she had died from drowning. But something or somebody, probably somebody, who knows, hit her a few times prior to her going into the water and drowning. And as I say, the last place she was seen was in that area where I had my encounter, and she's also somebody who is known to go back there on a frequent basis at nighttime. And for the same reason that I was going back there, because of the, homeless population, she was going back there to try to help them. And on this particular night, she ran into something that didn't want her there, and she was harmed, and she ended up dying, unfortunately. So, yes, there, one time.
That's really sad. Not a good way to go out, especially for a good Samaritan like that was only down there to help in the first place.
Absolutely.
Talking about the helping aspect, you talk about a horrible place. Any place is a horrible place to be homeless. But having to live in those conditions in Wisconsin in the middle of winter, being homeless would be unbearable.
Absolutely brutal. I mean, just to be out and looking through the areas for a limited amount of time on one night is about all I can take. These folks are faced with that on a daily basis, sometimes in worse conditions than what I have to put up with. So it's truly a modern tragedy.
Oh, I'd say so. Not good at all. After that, in 2013, from what I understand, you had an eyes-on encounter with what you believe to be a dog man. Please tell us about that.
Yeah, that was in late February or early March of 2013. It was just starting to really become spring. Snow was melting, but there was still some snow on the ground, and this was just as the sun was going down, but there was still plenty of daylight, so mid-afternoon that time of year. And I was coming into town, and I was behind a pickup truck, and as we're driving along, all of a sudden I noticed the pickup truck in front of me is slowing and then stopped abruptly, so I stopped. It was, kind of a slam on your brakes sort of a situation. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw that what had made us stop was that there was an animal that he had seen before I did that had ran. It was moving very quickly. It was very large, and it ran across the street, or the road, because we're on the highway, and went from one side of the road where there was woods to the other side and disappeared into the woods on that other side. And there were three cars. There was myself, the car in front of me, and then there was one on the opposite side of the highway that was coming towards us that had also stopped. And after this thing was gone, the cars, none of us moved for a few seconds. I don't know how long it was, but it was, it took a minute to kind of absorb what I had just seen. And I didn't even see the entire animal, but I saw kind of the back side of it, and it was reddish brown. It was huge, and it was moving very, very quickly. And what I saw had to have been on all fours, because I saw the back side, like rump, back leg of the animal, and then I saw kind of the back maybe quarter of its torso as it's moving across the road, and it was moving so quickly, and it was so huge, and everything was so overwhelming that it was hard to process. But when I think about it, it actually kind of makes me start to feel a little physically ill when I remember this, because I remember being in the situation and just feeling unsafe once I came to my senses and realizing the size of what I had just seen. Didn't have a tail, but then I never saw it again. And then we all just kind of went along our way, and we went back home. Or I went back home, everybody just kind of resumed driving again, and the rest of the trip went on without incident, but it was just moving so fast, and it was so big that it was hard to really kind of grasp it as it was happening.
I could understand why you wouldn't feel safe when that was going on. You said you didn't get a full view of the subject that was moving in front of that truck, but did you ever see any anatomical features that would tell you that was not a Sasquatch? It had to be a dog man, such as pointed ears or maybe canine-style legs, anything like that?
The canine-style legs would be what I would say would be the biggest one. I saw kind of the side profile of the animal. I did not see the face, and when I really started to pay attention, I was paying attention to that back leg. It was just massive. But it was a dog leg, meaning, it had the shape where it bent kind of backwards. But there was no tail, and it was very muscular, wide leg. And it looked like the animal would have been on all fours.
If you did see a canine-style leg, then that right there, that rules out the possibility of it being a Sasquatch. Seeing it from behind like that, you wouldn't be able to see anything to do with the face, but...
No, I did not see the face.
Did you have a chance to see any pointed ears on top of its head, maybe?
No, sir, I didn't. I didn't catch that part of it.
Oh, that's all right. I'm sure you were in shock, so that's to be expected. You said it was massive. How big are we talking about here?
Well, I saw it at a distance of 15 to 20 feet. So I was fairly close. I'm thinking that what I would have seen would have been a leg that would have had to have been between 3 and 4 feet in height before it actually turned into the hind end of the animal. And what struck me the most was not so much the height, but the girth and the muscularity of it. It was very clear that it was muscular, powerful animal.
If you saw it from behind like that, and somewhat of an angle, did you get a chance to see what its front legs or arms looked like at all?
The impression that I got of it was that the front legs were longer and more slim than the hind legs were. And it didn't move gracefully. It was kind of a clumsy, lumbering movement, not graceful at all, but moving very fast. The front legs were longer. I wasn't as struck by that part. And I didn't get as good of a look at that part either. I got a real good look at about the back 25%, maybe third of the body. This is what I feel I got a good look at. But I did get a good enough look at it to say that yes, the front legs were not as thick, but they were longer.
While you were there, you didn't see anyone getting out of their vehicles to try and get a better look at what was going on, what that thing was?
No, sir, I didn't. Everybody kind of sat there. I know that for myself, I was just kind of in a daze for a second because I was trying to identify what that would have been. Nobody got out of their cars, but nobody moved for, a few seconds, longer than people would wait. I mean, if a deer runs across the road, you stop. Once it's gone, you just move along. This wasn't like that. Everybody kind of just sat there for a second before we moved along. And what I was thinking about was the first encounter, because this was a very close proximity to that first encounter. I would say that we were within, not very far at all. Where I was driving runs parallel to the path where I had the first encounter, and what separates it is a golf course and then some woods. So we're within a half a mile of that first encounter. I was right alongside of it. So I was, wondering, could that have been what was making that noise that night? Because now I've encountered something on 2 separate occasions that, makes a sound I haven't heard. It acts like something I've never seen act with the tree shaking. And then physically, what I was able to see of it, it looks like something I've never seen before either. And I consider myself to be somebody who's spent a lot of time outdoors, and like I say, I've been in this area my whole life. I've never seen anything like that.
Oh, I could see why. Although, considering the fact that when you look at where you live and the history of reported dogman sightings, I guess I shouldn't be all that surprised that something like that would happen in your area.
Yeah, turns out after these encounters, I started researching this, which I'd never done before, and it does turn out that there's a pretty detailed history of encounters similar to mine within a 20 to 30 mile radius of where I live. There's pretty good history of it, in fact, going back way to the 1930s from what I've been able to find.
If that area is that close in proximity to where you had that first encounter, I wouldn't be surprised that you would see them there, because they really would have everything that they need. They've got the river right there that you mentioned walking next to that winter night. You've got open expanses of land which will attract deer for grazing and whatnot. I'm sure it goes without a doubt that dogmen, as far as their menu goes, deer would have to be right at the top of things they'd prey on.
Absolutely, and this is an area that, I know for sure that there's a lot of deer in that area. When you drive up and down that road at night, it's an area where you've really got to watch for the deer. It's heavily wooded. There's plenty of deer in that area. Lots of wildlife in general in that area. I've seen fox in that area, as well at night, which are, kind of rare to actually see. Things like that. So there's a lot of wildlife around there.
Is there much of a coyote population?
There is a coyote population in this area, and I've seen coyote cross the road in that area once or twice before, and I was really kind of surprised to see exactly how populated my area is when I went back and started researching this sort of stuff, because you don't see them as often. But one thing that I've noticed, though, is that they're becoming more and more visible to the general public as land is developed and buildings are built and subdivisions are built, and we're starting to encounter animals that had previously been pretty stealthy. They were able to hide themselves a lot better than they are now.
Yeah, it sounds to me like in that area they've got everything they want. The heavy deer population, they seem to like to run with coyotes too. It sounds like they've got plenty of coyotes in the area for whatever benefit that is to them. And then that readily available water source in the form of the river. I know you had another incident at a landfill that, if you don't mind, if you could share that with us.
Absolutely. And this was the incident that really kind of spurred me to start researching this heavily. After this one, I started to I borderline became obsessed with it for a while. So I have 4 kids, and one thing that I've done with all of my kids since they were little is we'll have what we call adventure days, and we'll pick a spot where typically it's a spot that I played in out in the country growing up, or a spot where I used to fish, or something that has to do with when I was younger, and we'll go explore that area, and we'll hike, and we'll fish, and we'll do different things like that. One place that we had consistently driven past that I just didn't know about well enough to ever decide to take my kids there, but they always asked about, was the old abandoned landfill, which actually sits on the edge of town here. And one day I decided, it was just my youngest daughter and I, and she asked about it, and we had some extra time to kill, and this was July of 2013. I decided to take her back there and just to take a walk through it. And when we got back there, there was a red pickup truck there. There was already somebody there. And as we got out of our truck and we kind of looked, and what happens is you're parked and you're looking at the area, and first you have to go down a steep hill, and then down at the bottom of the hill, you come to a kind of a swampy area where there's a pond and there's woods. And then you can also go up the hill on the other side, which leads to another set of woods. And as we're walking down the hill and we're walking towards the swamp, we see a gentleman come walking down the hill towards us out of the woods. And one thing that I remember is I was looking at him, and I just didn't feel like he looked like he was okay. He looked scared. He looked like, in fact, I'll just say that he looked like he had seen a ghost. I was actually concerned about his health for a second, just, as much as you would be walking towards somebody who looked like they weren't doing well, but it was a complete stranger. So I just said hello to him as we passed each other, and that was all the interaction we had. But I did notice that he seemed very shocked, so I thought that would be worth mentioning. But anyways, we walked up the hill, and then as soon as we got to the top of the hill, the first thing that we saw was that right on the edge of the woods, there was what looked to be some sort of a den. It was kind of a makeshift den. And the first thing was that one of the trees had the bark completely, it was stripped clean of bark, but all the bark was laying around the ground inside this den. Outside of it, it looked like it was like a mat or a carpet or something like that, like it was serving that purpose. And then also around the tree, there was kind of a blind built on one side that was made out of heavy logs that had been brought there from other spots in the woods. And then there was also another heavy log that was laid up in the trees between two of them, and it looked like it was set up there to be an area where an animal might be able to climb up and get a view of what's going on around it. And the thing about it was that these were such big, heavy logs that it would have taken several grown men to do this, and I don't really know what the purpose would be to do something like that. It was just kind of like a fort. So we were looking at that, and When we're back in this area, there was a couple things that kind of got us. One of them was that there was 2 spots where we found deer legs up in the tree limbs, 8 to 10 feet off the ground, and that had obviously been placed there by something or somebody. And we also started to hear knocking in the distance, and I know that there's been wood knocks associated with different cryptids, but just like something was knocking a piece of wood against a tree. We started to hear that from 2 different areas, as if they were a call and an answer. My daughter got scared, and so I got her out of there, and we took off, and I went back myself a couple days later and photographed the area. And I was able to get some good shots of the area, but it wasn't until I came home later and was going through the photos that I realized that in one of the shots I had captured an animal looking at me from a distance, well camouflaged but visible, very visible in the picture.
Looking at that picture, Mike, if you don't mind, please describe for us what you see.
Well, what I'm looking at here is a spot in the woods that was a clearing, and meaning that it's surrounded by trees, but this particular area has a lot of foliage and overgrowth, but not any trees, except for a couple of little saplings, maybe it looks like thin little things in the back. And one thing that struck me about the area is that as you walk into the clearing, there's a skinned log that is in the entrance, and then there's another skinned log set off in the back, and they seem to be strategically laid there. They're both kind of big, too. It would have taken some strength to get them there. So I took the photo for that reason. Now, when I got home and I was looking through the photos on my computer, I noticed that up in the top left-hand corner, between those 2 logs, but close to the back, behind some foliage, is a face looking out at me. And the face, as I look at it, there are triangular ears sticking up that are apparent. There is 2 eyes and a snout with a nose on the end of it that is also apparent. There's also hair sticking up around the ears. The ears are a bit higher, but then there's hair sticking up that just looks like somebody who's got messy hair. Just kind of messed up hair. And the face is just looking at me intently, and it's black in color.
Well, black's a very common color for them. It's a very eerie feeling knowing that you were out there and didn't have a clue that it was that close to you and it was there watching you all the time, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I questioned whether or not it was my mind playing tricks on me. I mean, am I wanting to see something, therefore I'm finding it? And I showed it to a couple people who I trust, and they see it as well. It's very unnerving. It's just one of the creepiest things I've ever had happen to me in my life.
You shared that picture with me, and I saw the subject that you're talking about, and it sure does look like a dog, man. Understand that for whatever reason, this is not a one-time occurrence. To illustrate my point, last week's guest, John had 2 or 3 pictures that he had snapped in his area, which I consider that to be Dogman Central, the area where he lives. John had snapped 2 or 3 pictures of wilderness for whatever reason, and after the fact realized that there were what looked to be dogmen in those pictures.
I can speak for this picture here. When I took the picture, I feel like I looked around quite a bit because I'm looking for things that seem out of the ordinary, and I never saw this. And then, when I go back and look at it, there it is. It's plain as day when you're looking at the picture. Somehow they're able to keep themselves very well hidden in plain sight. So I do have a photograph of both this area and a photograph of what I believe to be the animal that's living back there that I've encountered, and again, very, very spooky when I first realized that I had that.
From what you said about the look on the guy's face coming out of the woods there, sounds to me like he must have seen that same creature that you took that picture of.
In hindsight, I think he saw something. I think he had something happen to him that he wasn't comfortable with back there. He was just walking at a regular pace. It wasn't like he was fleeing the area, but at the same time, and again, I was a complete stranger, but at the same time, I got the definite sense that he was not comfortable, like he had been scared back there.
When you were back there looking around, when you went back the second time without your daughter, did you find any evidence that was out of the ordinary, such as strange smells or anything like that?
No strange smells. I've never had that. There were still deer legs in the branches. One of them was one that had been there previous, but there was another one that was not, either I hadn't noticed before or was new. And there were tracks. Now, there was one particular track that I saw that was larger than the rest. Only one print, not one set of prints, one single print. But there were a lot of dog tracks in the area. Now, this is close enough to town to where people could, and they do, take their dogs back, and, you know, people go for walks around the area. I don't know how popular it is because I've only been there a couple times myself, and when I was there, I saw that one guy, and then I saw another two kids, but I never saw anybody with a dog. But I would imagine people take their dogs for walks there. But there's lots of prints. And then there were different things that just seemed to be out of place. For example, there was one area that I found that I decided to take pictures of, that when I first walked back there, I stepped in a little hole that had been dug out, but it had been covered with sticks and leaves and things, so it wasn't visible. I didn't realize that there was a hole there until I put my foot down, and my weight caused my foot to go into it. And then I realized that the dirt that had been there was sitting right 3 feet away, as if something or somebody had scooped dirt out about, I wear a size 12 boot, and my entire foot was able to go down in there, so it was about that size, and up to my ankle, about that deep. So somebody had scooped the area, you know, dirt out of that area just that much, and then covered it with something, as if it was an alarm of sorts. Those would be about the only things that were actually in the area that I could say seemed out of the ordinary, other than the bark being stripped off of the trees and the blind that was clearly made by something or somebody very strong.
You mentioned finding that large canine print in the ground. How big was that print?
Well, I put my foot next to it, and as I say, I wear a size 12 boot, and it was lengthwise just slightly shorter, and as far as how big around it was every bit as wide as my size 12 boot.
This is a canine print that was almost as long as your size 12 boot.
Yes, sir.
Oh, wow. That's a big one.
I mean, it wasn't as long, almost. I mean, I would say, I'm trying to remember exactly, and I've got the photos, a couple of inches shorter maybe, not much.
I wear a size 15, and I know that is right at about 12 inches long. A size 12, if I remember correctly, I think a size 12 comes in at pretty close to 9.5 or 10 inches long, I think.
That seems right.
That sounds to me like a canine print that would come in at around maybe 8-ish or so inches. Does that sound right?
6 to 8 inches.
That's big. When you imagine what that foot was attached to for that print to be that big in the first place, that paints all kinds of pictures that you don't want to have painted.
Right.
Now, with all of your experiences with these things, with the sounds you've heard, with finding those prints, with seeing that creature running through traffic in front of that truck that was in front of you, has that changed your behavior out in the woods? Has it made it so that you just don't even want to go out anymore? Or if not, how has it changed you?
Well, it's changed me in that respect, in the way that I'm far more careful about where I go and when I go there, particularly if I'm going to be alone. I used to be somebody that you would maybe find out on a hike by myself in the woods around here, which I would be reluctant to do, particularly during the darker hours of the day by myself anymore, even though I've done it my whole life. I'd say that the main effect that this has had on me is that I feel less safe than I used to. I feel like there is something out there that hasn't always been out there, and I feel as though it's got the possibility to become aggressive. I drive at night a lot. There's many nights where I'm out in the, between the 11 o'clock and 3 a.m. hour, and I'll be on the highway out in the country, and I'll be driving around, and I'll start to feel a little scared. I'll start to feel like, at any time something else could come running out in front of the car, and this time maybe I'll hit it, and maybe it won't turn out to be such a good situation. I definitely believe that there's something out there that has not been there before, and I definitely believe that it's got the potential to become aggressive.
I can't detail any accounts where they did become aggressive, but don't think for a second that they can't. That is in their nature, given the right circumstances, or I should say the wrong circumstances.
I definitely make sure that when I'm out and about in these areas, I've always got protection of some sort. I'm always armed in some way. If I'm going to be out in the rural areas by myself at any point in time, whether it be, for recreation by myself, or if I'm doing some sort of recon for some of the volunteer activities that I do, if I'm by myself, I make sure that I'm able to protect myself.
In your area, and that's wise to protect yourself like that, in your area you said that there are no bears.
Well, there's not a population of bears that lives in this area, no, but there has been the occasional black bear that will pass through the area. We've had things like several cougar sightings the last couple of years in this area, a handful of black bear sightings, more than in years past, but still nothing indigenous.
Yeah, that wouldn't make you any different than a lot of other places where black bears are starting to move into. But that subject that you saw crossing traffic that had the canine-style back legs, bears don't have canine-style back legs. So for anyone that's listening to this thinking, okay, it must have been a bear, that wouldn't fit.
No, and that's the main reason that it wouldn't fit. I mean, I've thought long and hard about this, and that was the part that I could see the best, and that's the part that I was also kind of the most captivated by. It was the shape of the leg, the size of it, the muscularity, and it was very obvious that this was a large, powerful animal. And I was able to ascertain that simply by looking at this hind leg that I was able to see. It was definitely not a bear.
Isn't it a shame that when you were growing up and used to go out and do all that camping, how the woods had that innocence, but now it's lost that?
Absolutely has lost that. I don't have that, and I know exactly what you're talking about. It was a place that was very inviting to me, and a place where I spent a lot of time as a kid growing up, and as an adult now too, where I've always felt very drawn to it and very safe and comfortable exploring areas I'd never been in before. I've completely lost that. I no longer have that feeling at all.
Well, you're not the only one. I hate that feeling. I used to love taking deep walks into the woods, but knowing what I know now, I just can't do that anymore. In order to feel at least remotely comfortable doing that, I'd have to be with 3-4 well-armed people that knew how to use the weapons, and that's just not something that's just not good.
No.
But do you have any closing points you'd like to make?
The main thing that I would like to say here is that there's a lot of skeptics out there, and I was one of them for most of my life. And the only thing that I'd really like to say here is these sightings are increasing. I think that the sightings seem to be increasing about at the same rate as we seem to be, developing land. We seem to be developing land in areas where we had never been before, and as a result, the wildlife that lives in those areas are starting to become more visible to people. And I think that it's a matter of safety for us to be able to report these sightings without fear of ridicule. And I think that it would be, it's kind of on everybody right now to become open-minded when listening to things like this and understand that if we are going to continue to develop the land that we've never developed before, we're going to inevitably encounter things that we did not realize were there. And if we're encountering an animal that has managed to remain well hidden but is now having more difficulty doing that and is becoming aggressive, something needs to be done to deal with it. And the first step of that is open-mindedness when listening to somebody who's making a report.
Well said. It's just disgusting to me, the idea how many people go out there into the woods on any given day with no idea what's out there or what might be out there.
Right.
Not a good situation at all. Well, Mike, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. Thanks so much for your time and for sharing that with us.
You bet. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Don't be a stranger, okay?
All right. Sounds good, Vic.
Well, have a great night.
Okay. You too, buddy.
Thanks.
Bye.
Every now and then I get a letter from a listener that details an encounter with a dog man that they had that had all the elements except actually seeing the dog man. I've got a story to read to you tonight that fits into that mold. The gentleman's name that sent this to me is Ty, and Ty is from Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. The letter reads, and I quote, "Hi Vic, back in July of 1957, I had a very scary thing happen to me. I regularly babysat for a couple down the street from our family. Instead of paying me with money, we made a deal that they would take me on vacation with them for 2 weeks during the summer. I was 12 years of age then. Although we lived in a good-sized city, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and being a Boy Scout, I had no real fear of the wilderness. The couple's names were Chuck and Ray Gowers, and they had 3 small children. Chuck was an avid fisherman, so they decided to take me fishing. We piled into their new Ford station wagon and set off for southern Alberta. Hours later, we arrived in Lethbridge, Alberta, where we met up with Ray's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Hunter. Mr. Hunter was a true outdoorsman, and even though he was a prison guard, he was very gentle, patient, and a good teacher to the little boy I was at the time. He and Chuck were close friends, as well as father-in-law and son-in-law. Chuck always treated me like a younger brother. We got along great. Mr. Hunter took us to a very remote place in the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia, to a place called Blackwood Creek. When we got situated at a good fishing spot on the fast-flowing river at about 7:30 a.m., they asked me if I felt safe enough to fish there by myself while they tried a spot 2 miles upstream. I was a little nervous to be left on my own that far away from them, but I wanted to prove I was brave, so I said it would be fine. They had been gone for about 10 minutes when I noticed some tracks in the sand on the edge of the small river. They were about 1 inch deep in the damp sand and about 3 feet apart. The thing that scared me was there were only 3 toes on each foot, and each toe seemed to have a claw on the end. There was a pad mark behind the toes. I knew from scouting that they had to be canine tracks, but I couldn't figure out why it seemed that whatever made them had only 2 legs. They went along the sandy area to a point where they turned and disappeared into the forest. I never saw what made those prints, but all my hair stood on end and my blood chilled. That was it for my fishing. I climbed a giant boulder and stayed up there until Chuck and Mr. Hunter returned about 2 hours later. I showed them the tracks and they looked very uneasy. Mr. Hunter said we'd better get back to the car right away. I asked him what he thought made the tracks, and he said he wasn't sure, but even he looked unnerved. We left right away and drove up to Banff for the night. That night, as I lay in my tent, I could hear the adults talking in hushed tones around the campfire about the episode. After that, it was rarely mentioned again, and certainly not around the 3 little Gowers children. Those tracks were each the size of a teacup saucer, so whatever made them had to have been very big and heavy. I've never forgotten that experience, and I hope I never experience it again. That was the singularly most frightening thing I've ever experienced. End of quote. Thanks for sending that story, Ty. Before I bring on tonight's guests, I want to mention something. I love interviewing dogman eyewitnesses from the continental U.S., but I'd like to bring on dogman eyewitnesses from abroad as well. If you've had a dogman encounter and you're from the UK, if you're from Australia, if you're from Canada, wherever you are, please get in touch and let me know. You can do so by going to dogmanencounters.com and submitting a report on your encounter. I'd love to hear from you. You'll remember one of our guests tonight, Michael F. Smith, from episode 1 of the show here, where he came on with Chris Huckins to talk about the dogman encounter they had in Missouri. Well, Michael's come back tonight to talk about another pair of encounters that he, Chris Huckins, and a gentleman named Terry had in Missouri after we aired that show. Michael and Terry, welcome to Dogman Encounters Radio. Thanks so much for coming.
Hey, it's good to be here.
Mike, for starters, if you could give us a brief bio on yourself.
Well, I have a photography business. I also drive a school bus. My best friend and I have been doing Bigfoot research for several years now, and that was really kind of what led us into this dogman thing. All my children are grown, so it's me and my dog and Bigfoot, I guess.
That sounds like a good combo right there. Terry, I know you want to remain anonymous, so if you don't mind giving us a brief bio on yourself that won't expose your identity.
Okay. My name's Terry. I have 2 kids. I only recently started getting into doing Bigfoot research with Chris and Mike. They have taught me a lot. I ain't gonna lie, the first time I went out with them, I was kind of thinking it wasn't true. But until they started showing me, especially Mike and his photography, I'm a firm believer now. I can believe in it, and you know what? It's a passion of mine. I really enjoy going out with them.
Mike, in case there are people listening to this show, which I'm sure there will be, people that haven't heard you talk about in episode 1 about the encounter that you had with Chris, would you mind giving a Cliff Notes version of the encounter the 2 of you had?
Sure. That's the dicey one from an emotional standpoint. Yeah, we were, like I said, we've been doing Bigfoot research for quite a while, and we were in one of the research areas that we normally go to, and it was at night. We've discovered that Bigfoot are largely, not totally, but largely nocturnal, so we do a lot of stuff out in the woods at night. And we were sitting around the campfire, heard some noises down the hill from us, and saw some motion, so I went to investigate that. I came up to a stand of trees off to my right and saw something peeking out through the trees, and I was thinking Sasquatch, because that's what I was expecting, and then I started noticing that it just didn't look right, and had a snout and ears and things that I wasn't used to seeing. And I can tell you that it scared me a lot, which is unusual. I don't get scared in the woods very often. So I turned and did something I've never done before, and that was literally run back to camp. And Chris was back at the camp, and he really didn't, he thought I was losing my mind, I think. I'm pretty sure he did. And then in the woods up the hill a bit, over to our right, probably, 50, 60 feet away, this thing pokes out again, and Chris saw it. And at that point, he had a sidearm with him, and he yelled out, fired a couple of warning shots in the air, and then said that he was going to identify himself. We were thinking person or something, and shot at it. We think he hit it then, but we're not sure. But anyway, a few minutes, well, actually seconds later, directly across from our campsite, probably, 50 feet away, this thing came out of the woods again. And, again, Chris, I had it spotlighted, and Chris, once again, yelled, make sure it wasn't a person, said, I have a gun, I'm going to shoot, if you don't identify yourself, that sort of thing. and this thing basically charged out of the woods and started coming toward us. And I can tell you it looked anything in the world but friendly. The most malicious eyes I think I've ever seen in my life. Chris fired. At that point, it was probably 25 feet away from us. You could hear the rounds hit. You could hear them slap, see them hit. This thing staggered, turned, ran off into the woods, and we could hear it fall. And at that point, it was dark. We weren't going to try to track anything like that in the dark, so we packed up and headed off pretty quickly, then went back in the daylight. We could find, broken brush, that sort of thing. We could find the area where it fell, and we did find a couple of tracks and basically kind of tracked the thing into an area that goes into deep, deep woods, and we weren't going to try to follow anything there. But we found no body, no blood trail, and it took us the better part, I think, of a year before we even wanted to talk about it with one another. I mean, this was something so totally foreign to us. But that's pretty much the basic rundown.
Terry, when those two came back talking about that encounter that they had with that dog man, be honest now, what was your take on all that?
I didn't believe it. I was skeptical about the situation. I'm the type of person, I gotta actually see it to believe it. I didn't believe it. One, I didn't think anything like that could really exist. You watch the movies and it just doesn't make any sense. I was thinking that they had saw something else. I believed that they had saw something, but a dog man, I didn't believe it at all. So I was really skeptical about the situation, about believing it, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I don't think your response was any different than how most people would have responded to having someone come home and tell them about something like that. Unless you see one, it's just so hard to believe. I think that's only natural. Mike, since you did episode 1, and listeners have had time to respond to that show that you and Chris did, most of the responses are not all that surprising. Most people that left reviews and replies left replies that fall in line pretty much with what I would expect. But there have been some replies that, in my opinion, defy, common sense. Some people that replied to that show, they voiced opinions that you had been basically picking on some animal that just wanted to be left alone, that wasn't going to hurt you, that didn't give you just cause to fire on it. I want to give you the chance now to address that in whatever way you choose.
I can tell you this much. I can think of only one other time in my life that I have felt that threatened, and that involved a human being, not an animal. But I spent a fair amount of time in the woods. I mean, I'm 60-something years old. The woods are not new to me. I've encountered wolves, I've encountered coyotes, I've encountered bobcats and mountain lions and Bigfoot. And nothing has scared me the way this did. I've never seen anything that I perceived as being as malicious as this thing was. And I mean, I'm sorry, when something that's roughly somewhere between 6 and 7 feet tall and fairly massive comes at you bearing teeth and claws, you don't sit there and go, nice puppy. You don't debate it. There's no doubt in my mind that this thing was out to hurt us. No doubt in my mind whatsoever. And the only thing I can say there is, if you weren't in the situation, maybe you can't appreciate what it was like. And the thing of it is, Chris or I, neither one, we don't really hunt anymore. We used to, but we don't anymore. And we don't, well, in fact, it was a fluke that Chris even had his gun with him, because at that point we normally didn't take weapons with us. But no, we would not, if there had not been a very definite and obvious threat to us, nobody would have fired. But there's no doubt in my mind that we would have at least been, at very best, been hurt badly.
You know what? I can't blame you for acting the way that you did. I'm an animal lover through and through. But given the set of circumstances that you said you were faced with, I can't see how anyone could blame you for doing what you did. So I'm not surprised, and I don't blame you that you handled it that way. Now, moving forward, as if that one encounter wasn't enough, last October, if you don't mind, Mike, could you tell us about what happened with that encounter? And then I'm going to have Terry come in and give his point of view.
Sure. We were once again in one of our research areas, a different one from the first encounter, and not expecting that at all. We were getting activity from the Sasquatch that we were hunting, or not hunting, but looking for, observing. I don't want to give the impression that we hunt Bigfoot, because we really don't. We research, but we don't hunt in the other sense. But we'd had a fair amount of activity, and things were actually going pretty much the way they normally do with those interactions, and actually going pretty well. It's difficult to talk about it without talking about Sasquatch, because they were kind of integral to the whole thing. But they started acting a little bit differently, sort of excited, and at one point where they were sort of all around us, they ended up sort of all on one side of us. But there was still something moving around through the brush, and we went off into the woods a ways to sort of see what we could see. And this thing was, again, probably, when I first saw it, it was probably, 100 feet away, maybe 150 feet. And, we did get closer. The three of us are going through the woods. And at one point, Chris sort of took off in a different direction, and I thought that he was ahead of us, and I just wasn't seeing him through the trees. But apparently he had gone a completely different direction. And Terry and I are moving along, and we see this thing standing at the tree line. And, it was, having seen it before, it was clear to me what it was. I mean, yes, it was night, but the moon was full, a couple of days before full, maybe. But we had good vision, and I had very good night vision anyway. But there was no doubt in my mind what it was. We yelled to make sure that Chris wasn't standing between us, and at least let him know to get down. And Terry aimed, and he had a bead on it for a while, and then finally, I just looked at him with fire, shoot, because this thing wasn't going away. It was moving vaguely in our direction, and based on my previous experience, I was not going to mess with it at all. Anyway, ultimately, Terry did fire. It went down, and simply got back up and moved away. Then, a few seconds after that, Chris comes out of the woods, and we figured out that he wasn't where we originally thought he was, and he was kind of like, what he's shooting at. And apparently, he was seeing a dog man off to our right-of-ways in a different direction, and he was following that, and we all thought we were going the same way, and apparently we had split off. So at this point, in my mind, apparently we actually encountered two of them that night. The area we're in is a flat pine grove near the top of the hill, probably, an acre or more of flat area. And then behind that, there's a shallow ravine, and then on the other side of that ravine, there's a pretty steep hill. And what this thing did was, after it got up, was it moved into and across that ravine and up the hill. Exactly where the other one went, I'm not totally sure. But anyway, that's kind of basically it, I guess. For me, there was the same intense feeling of this is malicious. That this will hurt us if given the opportunity. No perception of poor innocent animal in any way, shape, or form. And especially in retrospect and thinking about it, it was almost like there were two of them and they were trying to separate us.
Well, I don't think anyone can blame you for not getting the warm and fuzzies when you had that encounter with the the dog man the second time around. Terry, this is where you come in. If you don't mind, please tell us about your point of view, what you saw, what you felt when Mike turned to you and told you to shoot this dog man.
Well, basically, we were, scouting out, going Bigfooting, doing research. This was even before Mike had come back, because Mike went out. He went out and did his thing. He just kind of walks around. He'll just take off and go walk around. And I ain't never seen this before, and I've been out with him before. Mike come back and had this horrible look on his face, scared look on his face. And then that's when I got this horrible smell. And, I had smelled Bigfoot before. It smells musty, and it was just not right. It smelled like anybody that has hunted before, and they bag a deer, and they're just cutting into it. That's what it smelled like. That terrible, bloody, that smell. That's what it smelled like to me. I had my 12 gauge with me, and I had Sabot hollow point shells. So we went walking off. We went down into the draw. We were looking around, and Mike froze, so I froze along with him. And like Mike was saying, Chris was off somewhere else. I couldn't say where he was, but where I thought he wasn't, come to find out. Anyway, across the ravine is when I saw some movement. And it didn't look right. I was like, what in the world is that? It seemed real skinny. It had a snout on it. And, wouldn't say, it kind of had legs, front legs, but it was upright. So, it didn't look right. So I took aim at it, I put a bead on it, and I just held it there just to see what it would do. It was clear that it could see me, I could see it. Like Mike was saying, there was a full moon out. And, Mike told me to shoot, and I shot. And I saw it go down. I saw it hit the ground. And, I didn't see it get back up, but I saw where I shot it. So we went over there to investigate. I was ready to fire at anything again in case something got back up or something come at us. Anyway, I know where I shot it, and it was right next to a stump and a tree. A rotten stump, and right next to it was a tree. So that's where it was. Me and Mike went over next to it, and it wasn't there. And I was very confused. So I'd seen it go down. How come it's not here? And I'm a very good shot. I've gotten a deer every year. I am an avid hunter, and, I've never missed a shot. And I couldn't explain in words. And, Mike and Chris both, they could see I was very confused. I was more in shock than anything.
Well, let me guess, Terry, you went from skeptic to 100% believer in the flip of a switch.
So you could say I was more than shocked at the situation.
Oh, I could understand that. Do you think hearing about the first encounter that Mike and Chris had, do you think that might have had a little bit of an effect of conditioning you for what you saw that night?
Absolutely, yes. Like I said, I wasn't a believer. I believed that they'd seen something, and then with that situation there, I 100% become a believer, and I'm definitely one of those people. I got to see it to believe it, and I believed it.
I can understand that. After you shot that dog man, and Mike mentioned that he saw it head up to that pine grove, after that happened, what did you do? So, to be honest with you, I don't know. I was in complete shock, and nothing really was making sense. I remember walking over to where I shot it, and we even looked around a little bit, and Mike walked up the hill to the pine grove, and I was still standing there in that same spot, just kind of pondering where it could be. And I was looking for tracks. I was looking for any kind of a blood trail, anything that a hunter would be looking for in the situation that he shot something and it got up and ran away. I've got you. Mike, when you went up to that pine grove looking for it, what did you see and or what did you do up there?
Actually, we've kind of got that reversed. We came out of the pine grove, and where it went, there's like I said, a sort of a shallow ravine, rocky, wet weather stream kind of thing, and then it goes uphill from there into really deciduous forest that gets pretty thick. And I just, I went a little ways up that way just to see if I could see anything, and I didn't see anything at all. But then we came back into the pine grove, which is where our camp was. I could see movement up the hill ahead of me, but I wasn't going to follow too far. I mean, at this point, in my mind, I have seen this thing taken down with a firearm twice, and it's gotten up and gone about its merry way. So I wasn't too avid about chasing it very far. No blood trail that I could find. Tracks are very difficult. This part of the state where we're at, very hard-packed rocky ground, plus this pine grove area has a very deep carpet of pine needle litter. So really finding tracks is very, very difficult. I could see broken twigs where something had gone through the brush, but no discernible tracks, and like I said, no blood trail that I could find. I'm used to, you shoot an animal that at least bleeds, but it was, I mean, the first encounter, I mean, Chris shot it with a couple of 40 caliber hydroshock rounds, which I would have expected to really tear something up. And it didn't. This time around with the slug that Terry put into it, and I have no doubt that Terry hit it. It baffles me that it got up and went away. Because again, I know that Terry is a good shot. I have no doubt that he hit it, and we were perhaps 100, 150 feet away from it at the most, and that's not a terrible distance to cover with a firearm, especially if you know what you're doing. So it was just almost inconceivable to me that this thing got up. I probably wasn't as stunned by that as I would have been if I hadn't been through the first encounter already. But the thing for me, I was frightened of this thing to begin with. That did not do anything to quiet my fears.
I can understand that. How similar in appearance was this second dog man to the first one that you and Chris encountered?
Oh, very, very. In fact, from the coloration, I would conjecture that it was probably the same one. Basically, same size, same conformation, configuration. Very dog-like hind legs, but standing upright. I have never seen this thing run on all fours. Having observed it a couple of times, I'm not sure it could really run on all fours all that efficiently, because the front legs, arms, whatever you want to call them, are long enough that I'm not sure it would be really efficient on four legs. The front limbs really seem to me more arm-like and not really paws like a dog or a wolf would have paws. I mean, they're kind of like that, but the digits are kind of longer, more finger-like. But same thing, teeth. I cannot find a way to describe the eyes. I really can't find a way to describe the eyes other than just almost like they look through you. And again, just to me, incredibly malicious.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Mike, because I'm asked from time to time what people report as being the most terrifying aspect of these things. And my answer is always, it's the eyes. That's what makes people sit up in the middle of the night, soaking wet with sweat, is how scary those eyes were. So I'm not surprised you mentioned that. Now, moving forward a little bit here, gentlemen, Mike, this is the second time that you've had an encounter where someone with you has fired on one of these things. Like you mentioned, the first time around, round one, it was a 40 caliber pistol with hydroshock ammo. This time, round two, Terry had 12 gauge Sabo slugs he fired at this thing and evidently hit. That had to blow your mind, as if it wasn't bad enough to actually encounter one of these things in the first place. That had to blow your mind, the fact that now for the second time you witnessed a friend hit one of these things, knock it to the ground with the shot. When you went to investigate, not only did you not find prints, but you also didn't find a blood trail.
Absolutely. Like I said, I spent a lot of time in the woods. I don't anymore really, but, at one point in my life, I grew up on a farm, I hunted and all of that. I'm just not used to that. If you take an animal down, you can usually find some indication of that. Like I said, I found broken branches, I found leaves and stuff on the ground disturbed, so you could see that something moved through there, and that something fell in a particular area, but nothing really to track it with.
That is really strange. Terry, you were front and center when this happened. You know that you hit it. It dropped with your shot. What's your take on this? You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, of course, but would you mind giving us an opinion on how you could hit something like that with a 12-gauge Sabot slug and it was able to get up still, run away without leaving any footprints or a blood trail? What's your take on that?
Like I said, it just doesn't make sense. A round like that, it should have dropped anything. And, the size of Dogman, the creature that I'd seen, it was more than enough to take it down. Way more than enough. And it just doesn't make sense to me that it wasn't right there on the ground where I'd shot it. If I had even shot it in the leg, it would have at least, some kind of indication would have been left, some hair, blood. It's got to have blood in it. It's just, it makes sense. And there wasn't any kind of blood, any kind of a blood trail to be seen.
That is really hard to figure out how it could not have left any blood or any evidence behind like that. Moving forward, gentlemen, as if that encounter wasn't enough, I was told that you had another encounter a month later in November. Would you mind talking about that?
I tend to wander out a bit from where our campfire is. Like I said, I have really very good night vision, but looking across the campfire really screws that up. So I have a tendency to kind of wander off a little bit so that I can sort of refocus and see what's around me. And I didn't see anything right away, but the thing that hit me was this incredibly obnoxious smell. We had smelled before. There was this sort of wet dog kind of urine smell. The only way I can describe it, and Chris and I sort of describe it the same way, is like hay in a barn. Like something had been rolling around or sleeping in hay. And that's not something that we've ever encountered with Bigfoot. It's very, very different. As soon as I picked up on that smell, the fear welled up because I knew what that had to be at that point. And then I came back to camp, and Chris was absolutely livid. He was angry because this thing was intruding yet again. You don't want to believe it, but once again, we did see it off in the distance. Neither time did it get up in our faces like it did during the first encounter. I bounce back and forth with that. I'm not sure if it's because it has a healthy respect for the firearms or if it's plotting a different strategy or what. But every time I encounter this thing, I feel hunted. Same sort of look off through the woods, same sort of basic shape. The last encounter was more brief than the others. And I think we probably looked for it a little more aggressively the last time than we had the other two times. But the one thing I do know is that once again it moved out of this pine grove and across this ravine and up that hill. It seems to me like that ravine is almost some sort of territorial boundary or something, because in our interactions with Sasquatch, they seem to not cross that ravine, and this thing seems to go back across that ravine.
That falls in line with what seems to be the case. Sasquatches and dogmen seem to prefer to keep a boundary like a river, a stream, maybe a ravine like you're talking about between them. They don't seem to be fond of intermingling. So it would make sense that they would have an arrangement like that. So that I've got this straight, if I understood your second encounter, the first one that you mentioned on the show here tonight, you three were on the move when you had that encounter, and shortly after the action started, Chris went off in a different direction than the two of you went, correct?
Yes. We didn't realize it at the time. But yeah, he did. Terry and I went left and he went right.
From talking to you in the pre-interview, Mike, I got the impression that Chris went off in his own direction because he actually saw something that he was going after.
Yes, and he described it to me as having the same sort of appearance that we have seen with Dogman, up to and including a tail. For us out in the woods, the tail is sort of a telling thing because Sasquatch do not have tails. So if you see a tail wagging around behind something, then it's probably not Sasquatch. But yeah, he was following and he thought we were following him. But, later on we realized that we were going in separate directions, and that's why I say I kind of come to the conclusion that there had to be two of them. Because the one that Terry and I saw and the one that he shot at did not move off from our line of sight until after he shot. And Chris, at that point, was following this thing in another direction. We had a little bit of a confusing moment there because Chris was going, well, no, I was following it over here. And we're going, no, it was over there. And it didn't really dawn on either of us, I don't think, until later on that, gee, there were two of these things.
That's a scary thought that there could have been two of them and you didn't realize it at the time. That's not good. Now, so that I'm clear on the second encounter that we mentioned on the show, the one that happened last November, from what I understand, you were around the campfire and it basically came into you.
Yeah, like I said, I had wandered off away from the campfire a little bit and was just kind of looking around when I smelled this. And as soon as I smelled this, I headed back to the fire, and yeah, it sort of came in behind me. But again, it didn't get anything like as close as it did in our very first encounter. And then we did end up following it out into the woods a little ways.
Well, thank goodness it didn't come in any closer. Now, so that we're clear on the locations of these encounters, the first encounter that you, Mike, and you, Terry, had together that we're talking about here, did that happen at the same location as the first encounter, the encounter that you, Mike, and Chris had that you talked about on episode 1?
No, it's about probably 3 or 4 miles away from where that first encounter was.
I see. This second encounter, the most recent one where you wandered away from the campfire a little bit and it came into you, with that encounter, did that happen at the same place where your first encounter happened?
No. The last 2 encounters were both in the same area, but not the same area as the first one.
I follow you. That makes sense.
Now, I will say this. The way the lay of the land is, the direction that in the first encounter that we had in a different area, the way the lay of the land is, where we tracked it to, like I said, where it went into pretty dense forest and we didn't want to track any further, is directly in the direction of where the last 2 encounters were.
Oh, okay. I see. I follow you. Terry, Mike had experience with encountering one of these things before, but this was your first time running into one. Did you have any problems with nightmares or PTSD after that first encounter that you had?
Honestly, no. I'm prior military, so I've been deployed and I have my own problems to deal with there. But no PTSD from that. It's just, I'm definitely more alert when we go out investigating than I was before.
I could understand that. Gentlemen, I really appreciate you coming on the show tonight. Do you have any closing points you'd like to make, Terry?
Well, not that I'm aware of. I think we pretty much covered it all down to a T.
That's all right. How about you, Mike?
Just you've got to be cautious, and you've got to be respectful of this thing at very least. And while after the first encounter, my advice was adamantly don't go out into the woods armed, at this point I have kind of lost confidence in how much benefit being armed is. So I don't know. To this day, I don't quite know what to think about this thing. I'm still very fearful of it because, like I said, I don't think I've ever seen anything that seems so absolutely malicious. But at this point, you know, I've kind of gone through stages. A long period of denial that Chris and I both went through. It's kind of like, no, this isn't happening in our world. Because I thought, fairy tale time, you know, not something I would have ever considered the least bit real. Now I guess I don't have much choice. And I've sort of run the gamut from sort of denial to, gee, I'm afraid of this thing, and which I still am, but at this point it's encroaching on the Bigfoot research, which is near and dear to my heart, so I'm also angry about it. But, you know, I don't think I can emphasize enough that this is not something you want to go out looking for to play with. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that next to human beings, this is probably the most dangerous creature I've ever encountered. And I don't feel like it's something to be messed with. I don't feel like it's something to play games with. I mean, I told you the other day that, you know, I'm a photographer, and that's my thing, that's what I do. And, you know, I will, if given the opportunity to get this thing on film, I will. But I'm not going to give it the opportunity to tear me to shreds. And I have a very firm belief that this is very capable of tearing me to shreds. I'll just reiterate, it's not a fun and games kind of thing. Above and beyond being one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in my life, you know, this thing is dangerous. I don't think anybody will ever convince me that it's not. I mean, since then I have read some things that suggest that these things in Bigfoot sort of go hand in hand and they're maybe kind of friendly. I can tell you that I absolutely do not believe that. The very first time that we encountered it, to this day I'm convinced we interrupted it while it was hunting down a juvenile Bigfoot. I've seen them back off from it. The last two times they didn't, but then they were there in a group and not as individuals. So where I'm going with that is if an animal that is easily 2 or 3 times my size is frightened of this thing, then I probably should be too.
Really good words, Mike. Really good words. One last question for you, Terry, before we close the show out. You handled that encounter or those encounters far better than most people would and do. You said you don't have any problems with PTSD, and nightmares also aren't an issue for you. I need to ask you this, though. When you go out into the woods, now that you know that they're out there, how has that changed your behavior out there? What you're willing to do, what you're not willing to do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm just a whole lot more aware of the situation than I was before, because when we went out before, I was aware of this, and I hadn't seen it. We were Bigfoot researchers, which, you know, I love doing. I love sitting around a campfire and just kind of waiting, and then all of a sudden a Bigfoot will come up, and that's when it gets exciting. But now I'm more, you know, it does put a strain on things now, because I'm not only sitting around a campfire, I'm also being aware of my 360 degrees, watching and listening for something else that might not be, and even smelling for something that shouldn't be there.
That makes good sense. Well, gentlemen, again, I can't thank you enough for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. No problem.
I really do appreciate it. Well, both of you, don't be strangers, okay?
All right.
You got it.
Well, have a great night.
All right. You too.
You too.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
Bye.